So today's talk is going to be about blueberries and blackberries, which are very near and dear to my heart because I really love all of the fruit crops. I'll be talking to you guys for a while, and if you have any questions or even comments, whatever you want to add, if you don't mind keeping yourself on mute, that would be excellent until I get done, and then I'll go through questions and comments, and if you want, you can unmute yourself at the end when we're going through all of that stuff. Today I'm going to be really focusing in on both blueberries and blackberries. These are two crops that I get a lot of questions about in general from folks. And I mean, it seems like people want to grow blueberries and blackberries. And so I'm going to try to give you information to help you get started if you're not already growing them, or if you are growing them but want to potentially grow more, or, do some of the best practices. And before we start, I want to remind everybody that we at University of Maryland receive federal funding, which means that all of our programs are open to everybody. And so we do not discriminate. I may occasionally pause for a second just to make sure I'm letting people into this Zoom room and whatnot. So today, what I'm going to try to cover with this talk is whether or not it makes sense, or whether you can grow blueberries and blackberries at your house, what you need to be successful growing either of these two crops, and how to avoid some of the more common mistakes that I see or hear about, or that people call me about. Kind of just to try to answer that first question, should you start growing blueberries and blackberries? If you do, you should probably be aware that they're not necessarily going to produce fruit that first year. Blackberries will fruit in the second year on second year canes, but you can get a fair amount of fruit per plant or per cane. The same is roughly true for blueberries. You want to grow them at least 1 year in the ground, usually, without letting them fruit. You can pull off the flowers, but then in the subsequent years, year 2, 3, and 4, you will start to have more fruit. I say that both blueberries and blackberries are fairly easy to grow. This is more true once they are established. But, when you compare blueberries and blackberries to, say, an apple tree or peaches, in general, it's easier to get a crop, good-looking, high-quality fruit on our small fruit plants. And then if you have a smaller yard and you think that, tree fruit maybe don't make sense for you, both blueberries and blackberries are more compact plants. But one thing I do want to stress before you get all excited about planting these is that you need to have somewhere in your yard that gets at least 6+ hours of sun. So almost all of the garden food production type plants that we talk about in this series require full sun. That is also true for blueberries and blackberries. They really are going to do best in an area with full sun. If we were talking about raspberries, sometimes they do a little bit better with afternoon shade. They tend to be a little more sensitive to the heat, but that is not as true for blueberries and blackberries. Some kind of cool things about both blueberries and blackberries is that they are both native crops to the mid-Atlantic. And at least blueberries, they were first cultivated, so first really grown commercially in New Jersey only about 100 years ago. It's a little more than 100 years now, but so blueberries really haven't been a sort of like domestic agricultural crop for that long. Some of the basics for growing blueberries and blackberries, I mean, I kind of went over this, but you're going to want to pick specific areas of your yard. I know this field right here, this is a research experiment that I have at one of our farms, but you want to choose a good spot in your yard. The most important thing I would say in selecting a site is that full sun and that it does not stay wet. This good drainage is very important for most plants, but especially for berry plants. They don't do well with wet feet, as we say. In this case, this field is completely flat. It doesn't have much of a slope at all, but you definitely don't want to plant anything at the bottom of a slope. or anywhere in your yard where you see that puddles of water form when you have a big rain event. Okay, so first I was going to talk about blueberries. The picture on the left is a blueberry plant in flower that was taken, I think I took that a couple weeks ago, or maybe, yeah, maybe 2 weeks ago, because blueberry plants have been flowering. They're about done flowering, at least in my area. One of the number one things to think about when planting blueberries is the type of soil that you already have in the place where you will be planting the blueberries, because soil is going to affect drainage. So how quickly, when you get half an inch of rain, that rain actually drains, but also how long the soil can hold on to that rain. So whether or not the plant is going to be stressed for water in a couple of days. Electrical conductivity, we don't really have to go into that, but this is sort of a measure of soil health, and the higher your electrical conductivity, usually, the easier it is for your soil to hold on to nutrients, and things like organic matter will help your soil have a higher electrical conductivity. And so organic matter in general is a good thing. If you get a soil report or a soil test done, you want to see high organic matter. It's good for most plants. Yeah, your soil is also going to affect nutrient availability and leaching. So depending on the nutrient that we're putting onto soil, or, when we're fertilizing, things like nitrogen move through the soil very quickly. Soils don't tend to be very good at holding on to nitrogen. However, nitrogen's the most important nutrient that plants need. And so things like higher organic matter will help you hold on to that. And both blueberries and blackberries need that. All plants need nitrogen. The soil is also going to affect how well roots grow. And this is super important for blueberries because they have kind of a weak, spindly, they're shallow rooted bush. So they just don't have a great robust root system. And if you have really heavy clay soil, the roots will have trouble penetrating that soil and growing out. One thing I've seen, if you plant a blueberry plant that's been in a pot for a long time, and usually it's in this soft, like peat mossy type soil, or maybe like pine bark soil, and then you put it in like heavy, heavy, thick clay, sometimes the roots will never bother to grow into that clay because just too dense, and the roots don't want to grow there. So if you have soil like that, we'll talk about how you can sort of fix it. Then uh, the soil type is also going to affect whether or not you have soil pathogens. The ones that we kind of worry about for really most plants tend to be things like root rot. I think if you've been gardening for a while, you've probably run into root rot a time or two, maybe even in your house plants. This usually comes from overwatering or when plants have wet feet. When the roots stay wet, that's when the root rots move in, and there are different kinds. We won't go into all of that, but so the soil that blueberries actually needs to have high organic matter. If you get a soil test done, which I think we've probably encouraged you guys to do before, if you get a soil test done, you will see somewhere on the printout what your soil organic matter is. You want to see for blueberries upwards of 3%. To give you an example, where I live down here on the Eastern Shore, we have pretty sandy soils, and where I planted blueberries at the research and extension farm here, the soil organic matter was probably, I think it was under 1%. So, I knew that's not great for blueberries. What was good about that soil is that because it's fairly sandy, means it's well drained, but it meant that I needed to add some organic matter in some way to make these blueberries happy. Because blueberries come from pine bogs. So in New Jersey, you'll find them growing kind of in these swampy leftover pine barren lands. Yeah, so the other thing that blueberries, ideally want is well draining, sandy, loamy soil. So loam is a mix when you have sand, clay, and silt in your soil. And The sand is what's going to help. Sand is going to drain better than the other two types of soil. If you have a very sandy soil like what we have here, where I'm at on the Eastern Shore, you tend to have low organic matter. If you have a clay soil, you tend to have higher organic matter, not always, but usually. But clay is going to generally hold too much moisture and be very heavy. So if you do have kind of a clay heavy soil, you could think about planting into sort of a raised bed or mounded up. And I may have a picture of raised beds. That makes a little bit more sense if you're going to be planting like a whole row of blueberries. Lowering soils pH. So this is like maybe the most critical thing that I want everybody to walk away from if you want to plant blueberries. Your soil pH needs to be very low, a lot lower than what it needs to be for any other garden crop. The only other things that really like this low of a pH are cranberries, and I don't think many people are growing cranberries. So yeah, a soil pH of 4.5 to 5.2 is what is recommended for blueberries. They really stop doing well when you get above 5.5 pH. They stop being able to take up certain nutrients, and I'll show you what that looks like in a little bit. What you can do to lower your soil's pH, because it's unlikely that your soil is already at this pH. That's why you want to get a soil test done. But this is pretty acidic, and most other plants don't want to grow in this. So you can use some, if you like, natural amendments, which would include things like pine needles, pine bark. Those are both acidic. And remember, blueberries, they're found natively in these pine bark bogs. So that's what they're used to. That's what they like. You can also use peat moss. It's going to be a little bit more expensive than bark, but it also has a low pH. So it's acidic and it's really, really high organic matter. So blueberries love to grow in that. The fastest way to lower soil pH is by using sulfur pellets or sulfur powder. I have been able to purchase these at not a big box store, but at like a local garden, home, seed and feed type store in my community. And I would imagine that most other communities around Maryland have some kind of garden store that will sell you sulfur if you talk to somebody that really knows their products. And the way that you use sulfur is you mix it into your soil and it gets digested by soil microbes. So they take in the sulfur and they basically turn it into acid in the soil that then lowers the soil pH. So if you are trying to lower your soil's pH and you decide to use sulfur, like what I did in my, farm type, more commercial plots, you still need to give the sulfur some time to get digested and turned into acid. So this isn't like an overnight reaction. This is like a 6 months or during the growing season type of reaction. So, and then the more you have to bring down your pH. So if you were, say, going from a pH of 7 and you're trying to bring it all the way down to 5, bringing that down 2 points, that's a big deal. It may take a while. It may take more than one soil test. And the more you have to bring that soil pH down, the longer you should wait to plant blueberries, because it can be kind of shocking for a plant if you're lowering that pH too fast. You want to get it stable and low before you plant blueberries. So yeah, I kind of already talked about this, but this is what it looks like when you spread and incorporate sulfur. Here on the left, we sprinkled it into the soil and it got tilled in. And our advice is to do this half a year before planting or a whole year before planting. The deal is if you put sulfur on in the late fall and then expect it to be ready in the spring, it will not be, because those microbes in the soil are only active during the warmer parts of the year. So these bacteria that break down the sulfur, they're really only going to be working when the temperature is above 55. Keep that in mind if you're thinking about planting blueberries. You may have to wait a while, get your soil pH right, and then plant. So caring for blueberries, of course, it's important to water them frequently. I kind of already said compared to a lot of other bushes like landscaping plants or compared to trees like apple trees or any other fruit tree, blueberries have kind of a pathetic root system. It's pretty shallow, so you may have to water them more frequently than other plants of their size and stature. It's great if you can mulch yearly. So the mulch in this picture of blueberries is pine bark, and they love growing in pine bark. What happens is every year it kind of breaks down a little bit more and more. Giving an inch or two of pine bark around your plant will help suppress weeds, but also it'll help keep that root system cool, and the roots really love to grow in it. And then spacing your plants, you want to space them between 4 and 6 feet apart. If you go 6 feet apart, you can walk around the full plant. If you only space them 4 feet apart, then you can sort of have like a hedgerow if you're going to be planting more than one blueberry. And real quick, do blueberries and blackberries require pollination? The answer is yes. Blueberries, you really need to have two varieties, so they pretty much are obligatory cross pollinators. So never just buy one blueberry plant, buy two different types so they can cross pollinate each other. And then if you'll notice this is a blueberry flower here on the right, the top right. There is a bumblebee on that flower, and blueberries evolved with bumblebees as their pollinators because of the shape of this flower. It not being open means that in order for the pollen to hit the female part of the flower, it works better if a bumblebee comes and sonicates the flower, which is basically it buzzes around the flower, and you get better pollination from bumblebees than you do from honeybees with blueberries. So I saw a couple of bumblebees in my planting the other week when I was out there and it was flowering, and I knew, okay, this is good because bumblebees actually do a better job pollinating blueberries. For blackberries and raspberries, you don't have to plant multiple varieties, so they don't require cross-pollination. Bees, regular honeybees, actually do a good job pollinating the flowers of blueberries and blackberries. You can have bumblebees do it too, but they're not as picky as blueberry flowers. Okay. Just a couple of varieties that we recommend based on a 2019 cultivar study that was done in Georgetown, Delaware. And some of these were growing in our research plots. Chandler, Legacy, Blue Crop, Lenore, and Sweetheart all did pretty well in their trials. So let's say you planted your blueberries this year, you know that your soil, you did all the soil prep and tests, you have low pH. What should you expect? Well, basically, you shouldn't let them fruit the first year. You should wait a year, and then in about year 2 and 3, you'll start having some fruit. They're not a super fast growing plant, so it's going to take a couple of years for them to get to full stature. You will have a gradual increase as the plants get larger in yield, in fruit yield. And then one thing I do think is really important for me to mention is that you may want to think about some level of bird control, because once birds have figured out that you have blueberries, they will be back every year for the blueberries. Birds seem to love blueberries. My experience is they love blueberries more than they love blackberries, fruiting pretty similar times, but I usually have the most pressure from birds in my blueberry plots because they seem to just eat them like candy. One nice thing about planting blueberries is it's pretty reliable unless they get some kind of disease. They can last for at least 20 plus years. I've heard of plantings that are 40 years old. So they're pretty robust, and they, as long as they get established right, they become a lot easier to maintain. The potential problems you could run into with blueberries are, one, the wrong pH. So this picture on the right, where you see chlorosis, so these yellowing leaves, this is a nutrient deficiency in a blueberry plant. This is very characteristic of iron deficiency, and that happens in blueberries when the soil pH is too high. This plant here is not doing so well. It didn't do a great job leafing, and you can see based on the yellow color of those leaves that something is amiss. So letting weeds get out of control, that could be detrimental to blueberries because they tend to be very slow growing. Weeds tend to grow really fast, so weeds can outcompete them and shade them, especially when they're small. And there are a couple of diseases. This bottom picture on the left is an example of a blueberry disease that's fairly common here, phomopsis, and a lot of times it just looks like the tips of a blueberry plant are sick or diseased. Sometimes you're getting black spots on the leaves, and sometimes even the fruit will have symptoms. Okay, so moving into blackberries here. So I'm going to be talking about blackberries, but just know that raspberries are very similar because they are both in the ribus genus, which means that they're very closely related. They have pretty similar life cycles. They both grow on biannual canes, which means that the canes grow for 2 years and then they die off. But what happens is you have these underground rhizomes. So these are stems that sort of function more like roots. The rhizomes will create new daughter plants, so new primocanes. So a good blackberry and raspberry planting should last between 10 and 20 years. So primocane fruiting or primocanes in blackberries are the first year canes. These are what are coming out of the ground, and generally these canes just grow the first year. There are a few exceptions to this where you can have some varieties that fruit on primocanes. However, most of the fruit production for both raspberries and blackberries happens for second year floricanes. So in the second year, we give the cane a different name. In the late spring and early summer, when the floricanes will be fruiting, really like the spring, so it'll be happening soon, and then fruit will follow that. Yeah, floricane fruiting varieties. So some black raspberries and blackberries basically have developed mutations, and that allows them to fruit on those first year canes. If for some reason they have a lot of fruit on the first year canes, they would still be able to make fruit on the second year canes, but they just probably won't make as much. So if you get a lot of fruit in the fall from a primocane fruiter, they're probably not going to make much fruit in the subsequent spring. All right. So, I kind of mentioned this before, but both blackberries and raspberries are native to the US. However, I want to caution people about this because I have heard of folks doing this. We don't recommend that you dig up a wild blackberry or raspberry and put it in your yard. We definitely recommend you try the varieties that have been bred to be more cultivatable. Personally, I don't like dealing with blackberries that have thorns, and all of the wild blackberries that I have ever run into have a lot of thorns, but they also tend to have very small fruit, short shelf lives, plus they could be bringing in diseases or, you don't know what. If you already have some other blackberries established, it doesn't make sense to go out in the wild and find blackberries to grow in your yard. All right, so here are a couple of the thornless varieties that we recommend. These ones with the space sounding names, like Celestial, Galaxy, and Eclipse, and Twilight. Those are all varieties that were created by the breeding program in Oregon. And then the ones with the more Indian American sounding names, like Natchez, Osage, Ouachita, Caddo, and Ponca, those were all bred at the University of Arkansas, and those, I would say, do tend to do very well here, at least in my research trials. Okay, so general requirements of growing these types of berries or blackberries are that you need this loose soil. It can help if it's tilled or worked prior to planting. The best times to plant are spring and fall. So ideally spring. For some reason you're getting your plants early. In the fall, we would say probably try to plant by October. Early October would be good. And then the irrigation, I say irrigation is a must. You don't necessarily have to have an irrigation system like one of these hoses here on the bottom, but just know that blackberries tend to be a little more hardy than, say, raspberries, but that said, they still are going to need water and plenty of sun. So blackberries are similar to blueberries in that they want higher-ish organic matter soils. You can be well above 2%, and that's good. It's just that we don't have 2% organic matter in a lot of our soils here, so we have to amend it. And for blackberries, you can do this with simple wood chips. So you could just get a pile of wood chips from an arborist or peat or compost. All of those things will help you add organic matter. Ideally, you want, again, a well-drained soil. And you'll notice here that the pH for blackberries is a much more normal plant range. So they can get all the way down to 8 or 5.8, but I would really recommend something in the sixes as your pH if you're trying to grow blackberries. So there are different kinds of plants that you can buy. Just be aware that transplanting may make some of these types more like easier or easier to get established than others. So plugs, these are like the little cell here that you see with a strawberry growing out of it. So they're usually little single cells in a big tray. And that makes sense if you're going to be planting a lot of blackberries. You can also buy bare roots plants, which you can see here in this top right picture, or sorry, top left picture. And so bare roots come dehydrated, and you have to soak them in a bucket or, just soak them somehow before you plant them to sort of wake the plant up out of dormancy. The other thing you can do is if you have a runner in this picture to the right, an example of, I'm trying to see if that's really a runner, but whenever a blackberry cane hits the ground, often it will figure that out and then start growing roots there. And then at that point, when it has its own roots, you can cut it off from its mother plant and get a whole new plant from it. So one of the ways that you can propagate blackberries is through runners. So nutrient-wise, it's a good idea the first year you're planting to use something like a 2-10-10-10. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the 10-10-10 or what the fertilizer numbers mean, the first one is always nitrogen. The second one is phosphorus and then potassium, NPK. Why potassium has to start with K, I don't know. But this is a pretty safe amount of fertilizer to give to a 100-foot row. And if you notice that your plants are responding well and want to give them another boost a little bit later in the season, I wouldn't fertilize anytime after July, really. But in the beginning of the season, and especially in subsequent years during flowering, that's when you want to be fertilizing. So for establishment, you want to apply 5 total pounds of 10-10-10 per linear foot. Yeah, sorry, for established plants. So that would be like second year plants. And you may add compost or other organic slow release fertilizers as well. So compost is an example of something that helps both organic matter to the system, but also can serve as a nutrient. So plant architecture wise, all of the blackberries you see in the wild that tend to be viney, those are called trailing blackberries, or that's the architecture type. Whereas a lot of the new varieties and those that I showed you on my list, those are more upright or erect varieties. They also have been breeding, and I really only showed blackberry varieties that are thornless. If you've seen the thorns on a blackberry, which there's a picture of that at the bottom of this slide, they're not nice. I think blackberry thorns are a lot worse than raspberry thorns. Yeah, so I just don't mess with thorny ones. And fortunately, blueberries don't have thorns, so you don't have to worry about that. All blackberries really will work better or do better if you have a trellis. Even those that say they are upright, they still do better if they have support, especially once they start putting on that fruit load later in the season. So here's some examples of trellises. They're all different types, and you can do whatever you want in your garden. This V trellis, this is what I have at my research station, so kind of makes a V shape. Whereas the T trellis kind of makes a T shape. And these are two ways to sort of keep the blackberry canes contained because they do have a tendency to go a little wild. Okay, so other ways that you can trellis, especially if you have a trailing variety, so these are the more vine-like varieties, you can use sort of a straight trellis with different heights of wire because what you're going to have to do is train each individual cane on a wire. So you kind of tie them all to the wire. Yeah, training blackberries. So when you're training a blackberry, you want to make sure not to tie if you're just using string or some kind of knot, you want to make sure that you're giving them a loose way to connect to that trellis. So this example on the right, these are basically the training tools that I use in my research plot. Here's another example of how you can do blackberries. You can weave them into some kind of yard or landscape structure. So this is at my house with the blackberries that have been woven into an arbor that goes over a gate. So it's very pretty in the summer, but also you basically have an edible gate. Pruning is very important for both blackberries and blueberries. I didn't really talk about it for blueberries because it's not really all that difficult. You take out some of the old canes when they start to get crowded. But pruning for blackberries is pretty essential because canes only last for a single 2 years, and then you need to get rid of them. So most of your pruning is going to be done in the winter, and you want to get rid of any of the canes that are growing on the ground, unless for some reason you want new plants and runners, because as soon as these canes end up on the ground, they're going to want to start rooting. So when you are pruning in the winter, you want to prune out anything that was a floricane the previous year. And you might be asking, how can you tell? Well, usually, like if you were to let it get this late in the year, which it's a little late to be pruning, you could see which ones aren't leafing out because they'll be dead. Or you can look for signs that that cane had fruit on it the previous year, because that would tell you, okay, this was already a floricane last year, so we can prune that out. You also want to remove any of the low-lying lateral branches. So what I mean by a lateral branch would be, so this is an example of a lateral branch here. And see, it has been cut. It was much longer, but you don't want these lateral branches becoming heavy with fruit. That fruit may end up on the ground. And so you want to keep these laterals pruned to a reasonable length. Tipping, this is like another form of pruning that gets done in the summer. So blackberry canes, I kind of mentioned this, but they tend to be very vigorous and grow very fast. So at some point in the summer, usually around July, the new canes, so the primocanes, start getting really tall, and you think to yourself, hey, I don't really want this to be any taller because I'm not going to be able to pick it. That's when you want to tip, and you can do that preferably when the topmost growing part of the blackberry is still soft. And so that's what these pictures are. That's still kind of soft growth being pruned. And tipping will encourage the plant to produce more lateral branches, and those lateral branches will have fruit on them. So it's a way to actually help boost your fruit yield. Here's a little bit more about tipping. So yeah, we're encouraging that lateral growth. Spotted wing Drosophila. I feel like I gotta mention this one. This is an invasive pest that has joined us in the US in the last decade or two. It's been a challenge for farmers, but it may also be a challenge for you in your homes. The key really at home, if you're growing your own fruit to not having spotted wing Drosophila, I wouldn't recommend that you spray for it. I think that's a little intense, but you want to just make sure you are harvesting your fruit regularly. Soft or rotten fruit is first place that you're going to have active larvae eating this fruit. So you don't want to give them that opportunity. You want to pick your fruit before it gets overly ripe. So that's the best way to deal with it. And then real quick, these are two different types of diseases that blackberries can get. The one to be worried about is this orange one on the right. That is called orange rust, and it is really problematic. If you have it, you should probably rip that plant out because it will kill your plant, and then it'll try to spread to other plants in the planting. Real quick, this is harvesting chart for blackberries. If you're interested in this, we have some more information on our website, and I'll kind of show you the fact sheet where I got that from. Okay, things that can go wrong if you're growing blackberries are if you don't have a trellis, your blackberry plant could end up like one we see here on the right. If you're not pruning, it starts to get too you have all this dead wood, might be diseases in there, so that's not a good practice. And then just letting blackberries go wild, they become hard to pick. They can just be a nuisance if they're not pruned properly and supported with a trellis. Okay, what to kind of expect if you're going to grow either blueberries or blackberries. Again, you're not going to want to harvest any fruit, or you really shouldn't be getting fruit before years 2 and 3. You can expect that for both blueberries and blackberries, the yield gets better over time to a certain point, and then it kind of drops off again. For blueberries, this is longer than blackberries. Blueberries take longer to get established. I want to emphasize again that you'll probably need some form of bird protection. Once the birds figure out that you have blueberries, it's game over. They're going to be after them. I do recommend something like a bird net or, another form of protection if you can think of one. Bird netting has worked well in general for us. I'll be trying a new product this year, but that is actually a laser, and I don't think it's going to be available for folks at home. It's more of a farmer way to protect your plants. So your planting should last for at least 20 years. Actually, for blackberries, that's doing pretty good. For blueberries, that's about standard. So we have information about growing both blackberries and raspberries and blueberries on our extension home and garden information center page if you want to look for that. Or there are a couple of fact sheets that we put out that tell you some of the basics about growing blackberries. And then with that, and I am gonna look through and see if I can find some questions now. Okay, so the first question I see is, can we grow blueberries and blackberries in a large pot? The answer is yes. You can grow both in a large pot. My recommendation is that you grow between the two of them. Blueberries work better in pots, and that's actually a pretty standard commercial practice in certain parts of the world. And it does make sense because sometimes the amount of stuff you have to do to your soil to make it friendly for blueberries to grow is so much work. Unless you're going to grow a lot of blueberries, it might make sense just to get at least a 5-gallon, but preferably a 10-gallon, 10 gallons or more pot to grow blueberries in. And then you can just, instead of using regular soil, you should probably use something like peat or even pine fines. Pine fines work really well for growing blueberries. So yeah, actually, blueberries grow a little better. Blackberries kind of like to spread out as they grow. They take over, and every year a new cane comes out somewhere different. So it really is going to work better if you put blueberries in a pot. Okay, so with blueberries having shallow roots, how well do they grow in a 10-gallon pot? Okay, that is exactly what I what I just talked about. Yeah, they grow pretty well in 10 gallons. You can use a larger pot, but you don't necessarily need to. And if you use a larger pot, then you have to get more soil media. So yeah, 10 gallons should be fine. Um, are raspberries very different from blackberries and blueberries to maintain? The short answer is that raspberries are pretty similar to blackberries. The difference is that blackberries tend to be a little bit more vigorous. Blackberries tend to be a little vinier. Um, Raspberries are a little more short in stature. Uh, the reason that we don't recommend raspberries, at least in my region, so on the lower part of the Eastern Shore, is that um, they're a little more heat sensitive. So the fruit is heat sensitive during the fruit season, and you tend to have a lot of damage. Um, as a home grower, I have grown raspberries and they do fine for me. They're similar growing wise to blackberries, and they don't even need as much structural support, so they don't need that trellis quite as much. It's still nice to grow them on a fence line and be able to tie them up to the fence so they don't go everywhere. But yeah, like growing wise, they're in the same genus, so they're very closely related. Okay. What are the differences associated with, oh, wait. Um, what are let me see here. I think this question is about mummyberry, which is a disease that blueberries get, and oh, the deficiencies that are associated with mummyberry. I can't remember off the top of my head. There are certain varieties of blueberries that get mummyberry more than others. The thing is that I have never actually seen it here where I am at. So I'm not that familiar with mummyberry. Like I've read about it, I've heard about it, but I haven't actually seen it. So that's one, if you want to follow up with me, I can figure that out and get back to you. Um, okay, what happens if the berries fruit the first year? So, what will generally happen if you buy even a 1-year-old blueberry plant and it's only this big, um, that first spring, it will still probably make some berries. Well, it'll still make some flowers. So, you can have a plant that's this big that wants to make flowers. You should go out and pick those flowers off before they turn into fruit. And the reason for that is that you want the plant to spend its energy growing rather than putting energy into fruit the first couple of years. So the first couple of years, you want the plant to invest in getting bigger, being strong, establishing a root system, not making fruit. So that's why we would say in the first year, pick off all those flowers. Um, with blackberries, if you sometimes when you buy the plants, you're buying 1-year-old canes already, especially if you're buying bare roots, like you may be getting a big tall cane and it's all dry um, when you get it. So that can sometimes make fruit in the first year. With blackberries, it's not as big of a deal. If they produce some flowers, I would just let them fruit the first year. Yeah, but not blueberries. Um, okay. Uh, with the birds enjoying blueberries, are there many wild blueberry bushes from the birds dropping them as there are with blackberries? You know, that's a good question. I would imagine, like I see wild blueberries in the woods, they tend to be um, low growing blueberries. If you're out hiking in the western part of the state, you may see wild blueberries, but they look wild blueberries generally look pretty different than like a cultivated blueberry bush, so you might not even recognize them um, unless it was fruit season. Okay. My parents have a blueberry bush on their property on the eastern shore that they planted 20 to 30 years ago. It's easily 6 by 6 feet, produces a huge amount of berries, but they are tiny. Any tips to get them to grow larger? So with blueberries, it's pretty similar to other types of fruit in that if you have a lot of berries, but the bush isn't that big, so the berry size is proportional to the number of berries in an inverse way. So if you have a lot of berries, a lot of times they don't get very big. And this is why commercial, say, apple growers and peach growers, they will thin off a lot of the flowers or a lot of the early fruit so that the rest of the fruit can grow bigger. Um, I don't know anybody that actually thins blueberries. It doesn't seem like it would be a good use of time. Um, the other thing that can really affect berry size is just kind of genetics. So this is probably an older variety of blueberries, and likely it just is kind of a more small fruited variety. So when you're shopping for a blueberry variety that you want to plant, you can look sometimes the seller will say like large fruit size. And so if you're interested in large fruit, I would say get a cultivar like that. Uh, it's going to be tough to try to get them to grow larger berries without either um, thinning, half of the flowers off. Okay, so bare roots are usually sold from the first year plants or older. Oh, are bare roots plants usually sold from the first year plant or older? Um, I think usually so I don't know that I've planted bare roots blueberries. I would think those would be about 1 years old. With blackberries and raspberries, it can kind of depend. Sometimes when you get bare roots, it's just the root, and sometimes you're also getting the stem or a cane with the roots. It just depends who you're buying them from. Like different nurseries have different production and selling practices. So maybe like read the reviews too. Bare roots can be a little bit harder sometimes to get started, especially like sometimes people will order bare roots and they keep them all winter and then they don't plant them until the spring and they can like dehydrate to the point where they won't come back. So just, and then you do have to really rehydrate them before you plant them out in the spring. Um, so if we haven't planted yet, should we wait until October? Oh, that's a good question. It's been so warm this spring and it's mid-April. I think you could probably, especially if you're because I saw some people on this call were in the western part of the state, and they're always behind growing season wise compared to the eastern shore. Um, I think you'd still be okay to plant like now, but I really wouldn't wait any longer. I would want to get your plants in the ground before May. Um, so yeah. And if you are planting now, just make sure you do a good job um, watering. And, if we have some more of these crazy days where it hits 90, make sure that you're doing a good job irrigating then. Okay. So why don't you want to fertilize past July? So the reason for that in really both blueberries and blackberries is because uh, you don't want the plants putting in a lot of effort into growing more biomass in the fall, because what can happen is you can have winter injury. When you get later into the season, like September, October, the plant should be getting closer to going into dormancy. And so we usually front load the fertilizer for both blackberries and blueberries in the spring during flowering, because that's when you need those leaves to be going. You need those leaves are what are going to capture the sunlight, that are going to make sugars and carbohydrates that allow you to have fruit. So that's why we try to fertilize in the spring. How long can side branches be and um, not cease from the weight of the berries? Um, I think this question is really about like how long can the lateral branches on a blackberry be without like causing damage to the berries? Um, when you're pruning in the winter, you don't want them to be longer than 18 inches. That's the rule of thumb. They can be, and that's for upright varieties, I should specify. Most of the varieties I talked to you guys about for blackberries are upright. Um, that said, my kind of rule of thumb is I just don't want those branches to be so long that they end up on the ground. And usually the the lateral branches have enough strength or support that they're going to be able to hold the fruit up. It's just that you don't want the branch to be so long that fruit ends up on the ground, really. Like you don't want to be picking by your shoes either. That's kind of annoying. So, uh, which diseases, in addition to rust, are bad enough that you should remove the plant entirely? Um, for for blackberries, it's really just that orange rust. The problem is that the orange rust can look like there's another type of rust. And so if you see rust or like those orange spores on the leaves of your blackberries, send us a picture. Take a picture and send it to like a local ag agent, or we have an Ask the Experts page on our UMD or University of Maryland Extension website, and we will help you identify what it is, um, because that one spreads and can take over your whole planting. With blueberries, there's not a super bad, like very contagious disease that I've seen be hugely problematic here. The one that I see the most is called phomopsis, and it looks like a little bit of tip dieback. You get black spots on the leaves, and the best thing to do is just prune it out. You could also, if you plant in an area that stays kind of wet, you could end up with some of these soil-borne diseases, like root rots. But those, and they can spread, but they tend not to unless there's another area where the plants also have wet feet. So the big one to avoid is the rust. Um, let's see here. When blackberries send up shoots, when do you celebrate and let them grow versus cutting the new shoot at the root or elsewhere to give away? Okay, so when you see new shoots in a blackberry planting, what generally happens is you kind of like personally, so I have my blackberries planted in a row, and when they stray outside of the row, when they get like more than 2 feet outside of the row, in the walkway, I'm gonna cut them off because I don't want plants coming up in the walking space. I want to mow that. Um, so for me, that's what works. Some varieties are going to make more new canes every year than other varieties. And in general, like per foot, you don't want more than 6 new canes in a year. Otherwise, it's going to get too crowded. You're not going to have good air circulation. Um, but this is like almost a little bit more personal preference, like as to how and where you want your blackberry canes coming up. Um, and yeah, you can always, a lot of times, if you have a new blackberry cane that's coming out in an aisle, you can kind of dig it up from the rhizome and then replant it somewhere else or give it to a friend. Okay. Do snakes get caught in bird netting? I don't know. I've never seen a snake get caught in bird netting. Birds get caught in bird netting sometimes. So there are lots of different kinds of bird netting out there. If you want to get one that is going to be less harmful to birds, you should get one that is more of a mesh. You should get one with tiny little holes. If you get one that looks more like a soccer net where the netting is like 1 or 2 inches wide, sometimes the birds can still get in there. Plus, like if the birds are trying to get in there, sometimes they get stuck and nobody wants to have to like clean up a bird that got stuck in their bird netting. So my advice is if you're really concerned about birds, get like a finer mesh type bird net. But yeah, I with the snakes, I I don't know that they get caught in there, and I've never seen that. So okay. Um, is orange rust the same fungus that affects eastern red cedar trees? Oh, like cedar apple rust? No, it is a different kind of rust. Um, Rust is a disease, like we use the word rust on a lot of different plants, but there are a lot of different types of fungal pathogens that get called rust. And most of them are species specific. Cedar apple rust, which is a really funny looking rust. If you Google it, it looks really strange and interesting. Uh, that's kind of a weird one because it can jump from cedar trees to apple trees. So most rusts are like pretty specific and like only mess with a few species. Okay, so uh, if an overeager newbie put blueberries in the ground before getting a soil test, what would you recommend? So, my recommendation is a soil test now is better than never, or at least figure out what that pH is. And if you find that, say it's 6.5, um, it's a good idea to put down some type of acid. So, you're not necessarily like going to kill the blueberry, like the blueberries aren't going to die overnight in a soil of 6.5 pH, but you want to, even if you can get some of that kind of azalea acid, they usually sell that even at places like Home Depot or other garden supplies stores. You're going to want to start acidifying that soil so that you don't end up with a nutrient deficiency down the road. And then every year, my recommendation is still to put on some kind of pine bark mulch, not just regular mulch, not fancy colored mulch, just pine bark mulch. Okay. At my last house, I had 6 blueberry plants. They fruited heavily. They were different varieties. So, um, some were large, some were smaller, and they had different colors of blue. Yeah, that makes sense because different blueberries produce different amounts of wax on the fruit. So some of them are like more waxy light blue, and some of them are darker. Um, I used to okay, I don't know what this is, mare acid in the fall and heavily mulched. They did great. I hated to move because I couldn't take them with me. I totally agree with this sentiment. If you can get blueberries established, because they are a little bit of a diva plant. I mean, you heard you've got to do all these things to get them established. But once they're established, they can be happy in the ground for many years. They don't take as much fertilizer as, say, garden vegetables. And as if you give them that good mulch every year, that's going to help keep weeds down, and they really like to grow in it. So, um, Yeah, it's exciting when people get blueberries established. And if somehow you got the fruit and didn't just feed all the birds, because that's impressive too. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for being here. Um, I'm looking here in the chat because I think I missed some of these messages, or questions. Let's see here. Um, oh, I see a message about huckleberries. Uh, so I don't know. The question is about seeing huckleberries growing in the wild, and if Maryland DNR considers them desirable, or not. Huckleberries are native to different parts of the US. I don't know off the top of my head which parts exactly. Um, My guess is if you're seeing huckleberries in the woods, like they wouldn't be an invasive species. Um, so, because they are like native to the US. Um, so I wouldn't be worried if I saw them. And huckleberries are another edible um, species of berries. They're just not like sold commercially, really. Um, and let's see. Okay. When should we replant plants into bigger pots? Well, this is kind of the same rules that apply for any plant. Once the plant, you don't want to let a blueberry or blackberry, if they're growing in a tiny little tray or cell, you don't want to let them get to the point where they become root bound. When the roots start to sort of curl around and they've taken up all of the space. Um, in the soil. So that will still eventually happen if you are growing a blueberry in like a 10-gallon pot. But if you're growing it in a 10-gallon pot, I wouldn't go any bigger than that. So eventually the plant will get kind of root bound. But um, if you're talking about like a little tray cell, I would change it out when you start to notice, like if you see roots coming out of the bottom, that's a good indication that it's time to replant, or plant it in the ground. How do you propagate blueberry bushes? Um, so commercially, you can propagate them via cutting. So what you would do is you take the soft wood, or new wood on a blueberry plant, and then you would just stick it in a growing media, usually like a sterile type growing media, like peat mixed with perlite. And it's going to take a while, and you're going to have to control that environment very well before that new cutting is going to grow roots. So I used to work in a blueberry breeding lab, and it took a couple of months for us to propagate blueberry plants from cuttings. Um, but that's how you get an identical plant to like the mother plant. If you were to plant blueberries from seeds, you would get a totally different plant that may or may not actually taste good or may have really tiny berries. So we would recommend, if you were trying to propagate, to make clones, which would be softwood cuttings. Okay. I see a couple more talks, or sorry, a couple more comments. Let's see here. Okay. There's just a comment about all of these sort of acidifying products that you can buy. Uh, yeah, anything that you can use on like azaleas, or hydrangeas, that if it has sulfur in it, then it's probably an acid that will bring your soil pH down, and you can use it on blueberries too. Yeah. Well, thank you all for being here. And we're looking forward to hosting you again. Oh, let's see here. Oh, the white drupelets, indicators of disease. I didn't talk about this exactly, but the white drupelets actually are not a disease. That is more of an indication of either sun scald sometimes. So if it's been really sunny and hot or a high UV index, sometimes the drupelets on a blackberry will turn white, and that's just normal damage. Some varieties are more susceptible than other varieties. The other thing that can cause white drupelets on a blackberry can be stink bug damage, and I saw some of that last summer in our plantings. So stink bugs have a sucking mouth part, and they will like go in and suck out all the delicious juice. So if you see stink bugs, try to get rid of them because they're going to make your fruit ugly. Okay. Uh, all right. I hope this was informative for everybody, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks for our next installment of the Backyard Gardening series. Thank you guys. Bye, everybody.